live at Sport Beach with Eleanor Hawkins, journalist and one of my favorite collaborators from Axios. How are you doing, Eleanor?
I'm great. It's been a good week so far.
Yeah? What have you been learning?
It's interesting because, as you mentioned, I cover communication, and kind of at the center of that is reputation. And, here in Cannes, it's kind of like a marketer's paradise. They're always thinking about reputation, but more they're thinking about creative. And so what I'm paying attention to is this push-pull between how can you be creative, relevant, and culturally in tune without maybe risking any sort of reputational damage. So I'm kind of covering this push-pull between marketers, communication professionals, corporate affairs. And one thing that's been really interesting, granted, this is only my second year here, but the amount of CCOs, heads of comms, and heads of corporate affairs that are showing up here is dramatically increasing, because I think you're seeing that overlap of who owns brand and how it relates to reputation.
That's really interesting, and we kind of learned that a little bit with our Axios Harris Poll 100, and maybe that's a kind of a good place to start on that sort of push-pull, because I think we were fascinated, weren't we, to see 40% of corporate reputations, 44% of reputations dropped. And talk a little bit about that. You wrote a piece on it, but a lot of it seemed to be related to marketing, to pricing.
A lot of it has to do with pricing. A lot of it has to do with just macroeconomics, where we are as a world. And it's not so much about how a brand or how a company makes you feel, so much as what are they actually doing for you. So pricing is a big issue, in the same way that maybe values-based or mission-oriented companies were on the rise a few years back. Now it's flipped completely, and folks are more focused on what is your product and what are you doing for me, and are you accounting for inflation?
Yeah, it really seemed to be the dominant narrative this year, and it was the second year in a row, because we started to see this happening in 2024, but this year, the continuation of inflation, the idea that reputation is dropping because most Americans are really struggling, or at least they're very price conscious, and so passing along profits was something we saw in the contextual sort of feedback, or not keeping their prices, or even cynicism about tariffs. Was that interesting?
Right. The tariffs is a big factor. But I think what's been interesting is some of the high-ranking companies, for example, Arizona Beverage Company, right? 99 cents for a big iced tea. Costco. Not only are they known for their warehouse and their supplies, but they're known for their very affordable menu that they said they weren't going to change. I'll also add, though, that Costco kind of transcends, because the company has a reputation of being very mission-driven and values-first. They are one of those companies that stood strong when it came to any sort of DEI walk-back or ESG walk-back. And so that is an interesting trend. They've been able to do both and capture both. And that's kind of what I'm always looking at, is who are the companies that are transcending demographics? Who are the ones that are able to bring comfort in this chaotic time, and whether comfort is allowing you to have a little bit more money in your wallet or making you feel valued and seen. That's what brands are trying to tap into right now.
It's really interesting. You talk about transcending demos. I mean, Trader Joe's, which was number one this year, fit that bill, right?
Yeah, Republicans and Democrats love Trader Joe's.
Well, speaking about that, you could also have really established values that could work even if a certain audience doesn't necessarily agree with those values, right? Talk about Ben & Jerry's and Chick-fil-A.
Yeah, and I think this is something that you've touched on too, is there's consistency is rewarded, right? The whiplash, the kind of changing really quickly is kind of the kiss of death when it comes to reputation, because then you lose trust. And consumers don't really know what you stand for. And so that is one thing that we see, and you can probably speak to this too, is like, consistently Patagonia, Ben & Jerry's, but also Hobby Lobby, Chick-fil-A rank really high, because while people might not agree with the business values, they know what it stands for and they can appreciate it, and then they can choose how they spend their money. They don't feel like they're being like hoodwinked in a way.
I think that's right. And it's sort of old-fashioned, but this idea of just being consistent in how you present yourself is so important today, because everything else seems so chaotic and seemingly out of control. So I know, really, really great insights. Anything else from the survey? I know you pulled on a couple of things. Maybe we talk about AI. I thought it was really interesting.
Yeah.
Right?
Slow down.
Slow it down, right?
Yeah, and I think after the survey came out, so What we found is that, first of all, a majority of people don't really have a clear understanding of what the technology is and where it's going.
Right.
And so it's a huge communication challenge because it's not a tangible thing, right? So it's hard to explain the impact that it's going to have on everyone's life. And so we're starting to see a lot of concern around job displacement. And you know, the CEO of Anthropic, in an interview with Axios, came out and said this is going to displace at least 20% of white-collar jobs.
Made a lot of headlines.
Made a lot of headlines and had a lot of people sit back and say, wait a second. And so that's something that I'm tracking, is not only how AI is kind of infiltrating the workplace and changing the way that we work and live, but also how it's being communicated right now. Because I think what we're going to see is you have a lot of, you know, the AI hype bubble. You have a lot of companies who are coming out and saying, I'm an AI company, I'm an AI company.
Exactly.
And maybe that's a great way to raise money, but it is going to cause a little bit of distrust within your workplace, within maybe your consumer base. I do anticipate that AI will become a wedge issue at some point. Anything that disrupts.
That's interesting. Yeah.
That's what I'm tracking. Yeah, just because I think the messaging is so misunderstood.
Yeah.
And there's so many different terms that are being used, whether it's agentic AI or AGI, or like nobody really knows what they're talking about. And so I do think that there's a potential for that technology to be kind of weaponized, especially as jobs start to be displaced.
And that's why I think in the Axios Harris Poll 100, we saw that 77% of Americans would prefer that companies move slowly and get AI right the first time.
Yep, because there's no putting the genie back in the bottle after the fact.
No, absolutely. Well, I thought it was interesting that you actually saw marketing considerations impacting reputation. And talk a little bit about that, because I mean, you kind of study both sides. You talk to CCOs, communicators, you talk to marketers, but there seems to be sort of an interesting dynamic there, right? And the genius of, I think, of our survey is it's American consumers that are actually rating corporate reputations.
Yeah, it's interesting, and kind of what I'm seeing here. So I've met with several CMOs, I've met with several CCOs and heads of corporate affairs, and there's a disconnect when it comes to how they think about building reputation. CMOs right now are like, let's be very creative. Let's try to break through the noise, get in the zeitgeist, find some sense of culture that we can tap into. Fandoms are a really big thing, right? Like, how can our brand tap into these pre-existing fandoms? Which is all great and super fun. But what I'm hearing from communication and corporate affairs professionals is
governance.
There's so much risk. There's so much risk. And we want to make sure, what I'm hearing from them is we want to make sure that any sort of marketing we're doing, any sort of campaign we're doing actually ties back to the business. We're not just doing things to get in the conversation anymore. I think Instacart is a really interesting example of this. Their Super Bowl ad that came out, it was all about nostalgia, and they were really targeting that like millennial mom who makes all the purchases. And they were able to do it in a way that activated around the Super Bowl, kind of tapped into that fandom, but was unique to a specific consumer. So you've got to understand the audience, the consumer, and then tie it back to the business. And I think marketers right now are like, we just want to break through. We just want to find those fandoms. We just want to be loud. And we also want to show up across all of these different platforms. And comms people are looking at the risks.
I think it's really interesting, Eleanor, because when you think about the consumer, which we do with our survey, they buy brands from companies they admire, right? So they're actually looking at them sort of more holistically. And so the more that these two sides of the C-suite are talking, is that kind of what you're saying?
Well, but the other thing that's really interesting is there's a disconnect too with these fan bases that they're trying to tap into, or the creators, athletes. Because I've had interviews now. I spoke with Gabrielle Union.
Yeah.
And I asked her, what do you look for in a brand? And she said, a brand that aligns with my values. That is first and foremost. They can come in and they can pitch me all they want, but I'm going to go and do my research. I'm going to look at their board. I'm going to look at their corporate values. And I'm not going to engage with a brand unless they're doing those things. And so I do think there's this idea of like, we're shying away from values-based. We're going to focus more on product, community, fandom. But on the back end, those influencers that you need to reach those audiences still care. And so it's this really, really, really challenging place.
Not easy to be a marketer or communicator or anyone.
No, but I do think they're starting to work more closely, more hand in hand. And that's something I'm going to continue to track, is just this integration of comms and marketing.
Terrific. We've been talking with Eleanor Hawkins from Axios. Together with the Harris Poll, we run the Axios Harris Poll 100 and lots of other projects along the way. Eleanor, it's been so good to talk to you. Enjoy the rest of Cannes.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.